Good morning. Stephen just mentioned I'm a Senior Fellow Emeritus at the Policy Studies Institute. That accolade of Emeritus was given to me 22 years ago. I've been with the Institute now for 43 years, which is a very unusual relationship, but ideal as far as I'm concerned, because the purpose of the Institute was set up in the same year that I was set up, 1931. It was set up in order to carry out research which hopefully would be of benefit for policymakers and the general public. That's just by way of introduction. To talk about this subject I find unenviable to a degree, insofar as what I hope you will come away with is a view about the future which is as bleak as it can get. Now, nobody wants to talk about that, but I see that as the reality that we have attempted to escape by people saying, for instance, Martin Luther King didn't come forward and say, I have a nightmare. He came forward and said, I have a dream. I don't have a dream, I have a nightmare. And I think that one has got, at this point in history, to admit to the fact that the future is indeed bleak. Society is demonstrating all too clearly its strong preference for downplaying the significance of climate change and the changes that must be made if we are to limit its devastating impacts. It's seen neither as the overarching background against which decisions affecting the future must be made, nor as one that needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency, owing to the fact that any increase, even just these lights, any increase in greenhouse gas emissions can only make matters worse. And the resolution of the problems that come in the wake of climate change, it can only make them even less tractable. Yet governments around the world, and indeed with the connivance of the general public, continue to pay grossly insufficient attention to this reality. I mean, nobody can deny, because of the rising, because emissions accumulate in the atmosphere, in the case of carbon dioxide, for over 100 years, that and yet the general view of the public is that this is a problem that can be switched on and off, and if we really are worried about carbon emissions, then all we've got to do is to stop doing things, as if that will be the end of it and we'll be relieved from any problems that come in its wake. But instead of doing what we need to do because of this issue of any additional fossil fuel-based activity making the problem greater, governments around the world see as one of their main aims accommodating as much as possible public demand, albeit with some limited consideration to the wider social, economic and environmental consequences. But I observe that it is extraordinary to realise that the origins of that demand that the governments are trying to meet are personal decisions reached with little, if any, regard to these consequences, rather than, as it should be, to the finite capacity of the global atmosphere to absorb further emissions if we are not to exceed what has been calculated to be its safe limits. The public appears to be hardwired into believing that it has an inalienable right, for instance, to choose its family size, to travel further and faster and more frequently by road, rail and air, to take advantage of the rising opportunities that technology has opened up for us. And that means that we can go ever farther, ever more frequently, ever more distantly for leisure purposes, social occasions, sporting events, professional conferences and business meetings. All policymakers subscribe to the view that future prosperity lies in, I should say these comments don't relate to the Green Party, of which I am not a member. Nearly all policymakers subscribe to the view that future prosperity lies in promoting and facilitating continuing growth of their country's economy, such as in tourism, and typically, especially energy-intensive activity heavily dependent upon flying. That entails turning a blind eye to the fact that to accommodate it, there's the need for greater investment in energy-intensive infrastructure and transport systems that, in the words of Bill Hutton in The Observer last year, the systems that, quotes, we so desperately need. And one can seize the way in which this government has responded by approving of such energy-intensive facilitators as HS2, Crossrails 1 and 2, new airport capacity, and so on. It's almost as if their minds are blocked off. They're incapable. Governments and successive governments, and it applies around the world too, seriously seem incapable of relating the fact that if you build more infrastructure to accommodate more energy-intensive activities, then you're making the problem, as I said before, even less tractable than it is already. The unquestioned acceptance of the desirability of developments such as these was reflected without critical comment in another Observer reference to the fact that Sir Peter Hall, this was in another edition of the Observer, Sir Peter Hall has flown 70,000 miles each year for the last 40 years. I mean, I find that extraordinary. There were no letters in the Observer in the following week saying, wow, this is extremely damaging. But it was written, the article was written in a way that would encourage people to think, gosh, what an amazing fellow, rather than what an absolute bastard for engaging in such damaging activities which will lower the quality of life and probably threaten the lives of many, many people in the future. No comment on it. The same is true about the Olympics. The Olympics is, as we know, an international venture which requires and promotes and subsidises people to travel all over the world, long distances. Again, a highly energy-intensive activity. And it's as if, well, yes, but people love the Olympics. Well, just because people love the Olympics and the occasion and so on, and welcome the fact that their country is chosen as the site for the next Olympics, does not in any way whatsoever justify it. Ideas like the Olympics and their, so to speak, their prosecution, all sort of international events, and all business events, and all tourist events, and all leisure events that entail travel that are in any way energy intensive, not should be reduced, but have got to stop. And there is no indication from the general public that it would be prepared to accept that. And that is why, in my opening remark, I made the statement that how bleak the future is. If you stop anybody and say to them, would you, on a voluntary basis, forego flying, never fly again, 99% of them will say no. And yet that is essential if we are to deliver for future generations an environment, a qualitative environment, which is not in sharp decline. There is now near consensus in the scientific community that the manifestations of climate change are occurring at an accelerating rate and that human activity is a significant contributor. One of the most eminent climate scientists in the world, James Hansen, now warns of the dangers of the concentration of carbon emissions exceeding 350 parts per million, whereas it is already 400, and the government in this country continues to spell out the extreme difficulties of limiting it to 500, double the level of the last million years or so. One of the latest conclusions of the IPCC, and we'll hear about it this weekend, alarmingly states that the total remaining global carbon budget, this was made last autumn, this statement, is only 250 gigatons if the safe ceiling of concentration is not to be breached. And yet the Met Office, and no doubt we'll hear about this, informing the Climate Act in 2008 calculated that it was 580 gigatons. We've got to understand what the budget is, what more emissions the planetary atmosphere can absorb before we go ahead and blindly go on talking about the expansion of this and the economic growth that can be achieved in that area of activity. It's no wonder that last year Nicholas Stern, one of the most influential government advisors, made a public statement that the situation is far, far worse than he realised when writing in his 2006 report on the economics of climate change. And when Connie Hedegaard, the European Commissioner on climate change, was challenged, I should say by me, a few months ago to indicate what steps could now be taken to reverse the process resulting in the melting of the Arctic ice cap, she responded disarmingly, "We must be optimistic." I mean, I find that quite extraordinary. This is the person leading the charge on the correct policies that need to be adopted in the face of climate change, and all she can do is say we've got to be optimistic. And of course the sad thing is that she's right, because there isn't any means available within the time available, within the cost constraints that are imposed by taking global action on the scale that is necessary. At the heart of this impending tragedy lie a number of erroneous assumptions widely subscribed to, and in this and probably all countries and all by their main political parties, reflecting dangerous element of wishful thinking. These include, and I've just listed a few of them, but they are key ones, that people have an inalienable right to engage in fossil fuel-based activities, provided that there is no alternative entailing less energy than previously. I mean, that is extraordinary. Really extraordinary, bearing in mind, I go back to the same point, that any further burning of fossil fuels is making the problem greater. And of course, when it's on the scale of this order, then one can't just have the public thinking, oh, I've never been to Niagara Falls, I'll take the family there, you know, as if that provides a justification for doing such damage by adding to the global atmosphere's greenhouse gases when we are so close, if not beyond the point of it being replete, and that there can be now no reversal process which will enable us to get back to a safe level of concentration. The next amazing assumption is that somehow or other, economic growth can be reconciled with providing adequate protection from climate change. It so obviously can't, and the fact that we have been aware for the last 30 years of the issue of climate change and its link with energy-intensive activities, it's really extraordinary that it is assumed, and yes, with the outcome that the level of emissions, global level of emissions, is not changing very much, whereas we know that it's got to go down like that to as close to zero carbon as is possible to achieve. The other remarkable thing allied to that is the fact, and I mean, I'm speechless almost in saying this because it's so obvious, that in government policy there's no differentiation made between activities being promoted by government or paid for or subsidised by government, no distinction made between those which are good to limit the damage of climate change and those that are bad. Well, those that are bad, by definition, are certainly things like airport expansion, and yet there's no distinction. All that happens is you hear statements made that whether it's with the G7 or whether it's within the European community, the measure of GDP does not make that differentiation. I put this to Ed Miliband about a year ago and said, how can you, or will you, if in government, intercede to ensure that that consideration of whether this is good for the planet or bad for the planet, and his response after a short pause during which I read in his eyes, "Shit, why don't you bugger off?" What he said was, "But surely you know that a Labour government has adopted green credentials." I mean, as if to, so what you've said is not relevant, but have you heard a statement made by any party other than the Greens on this whole issue? One cannot just go on ignoring such relevant matters. Let's take another one. Sufficient cuts can be made in greenhouse gas emissions by a combination of technological developments aimed at decoupling their strong link to achieve more fuel efficiency, switching to renewable energy, carbon sequestration, and so on. You will hear and have heard over and over again reference to what the government is doing on achieving a reduction in carbon emissions. That can be interpreted as a complete lie, simply because what is being proposed, like with offshore wind farms, to say that that is cutting back on carbon emissions is not true. What it is doing is reducing the rate of increase. It's not the only way of reducing carbon emissions is by taking it out of the atmosphere, and no technological breakthrough it can be foreseen within quite a period of time that would enable us to do that, to suck out greenhouse gas emissions, particularly carbon dioxide and methane, out of the atmosphere. And yet we hear over and over again this is contributing to the government's target on carbon reduction. It is the rate of increase. They're not going down, because they are accumulating in the atmosphere. That is such a powerful point that seems to have been sidestepped. And why? Because of its implications. And so many of the points I'm trying to raise here relate to that. The implications of coming to terms with the fact that really we must not talk about an 80% reduction by 2050 in this country, or indeed in the world, because that implies that in that process, even going up to 2050, that there's still a substantial continued volume of emissions going into the atmosphere, making the matter worse. One could talk about the role of nuclear power that James Hansen and George Monbiot seem to support, overlooking the fact that what it implies is that if that is good enough for countries in Western affluent countries to have nuclear power as the source of electricity generation, then it's acceptable for all countries to do it. All countries around the world. Do we really want to live in a world where every country is generating its electricity through the medium of nuclear power and taking the risks, taking the problems associated with that, which is the disposal of radioactive waste, as well as the risks of proliferation for other wartime purposes? Another one is that one cannot proceed in this area unless you attach a price to a tonne of carbon, which is what is done in a lot of government policy. But again, it overlooks the fact that we have got a fixed tonnage that we can burn if we are not to exceed the 2-degree rise in temperatures that we've been told are irreversible. What would be appropriate would be to refer to the price of a tonne of this 260 gigatons, give that a price, and that would stop decision makers in their tracks with a vengeance. Another proposition which is extraordinary, which is, yes, at the heart of the problem is education. If we can educate the public how grave the situation, then governments can proceed to take more draconian measures to limit emissions. Well, 2 years ago, I was at a conference where somebody made that very point, that really right at the heart of the matter is educating the public, at which point I stood up and said to the audience, we are here in this conference because we believe ourselves to be very well informed about climate change and its causes. Everybody nodded their head, and then I said, and how many of you have flown in the last year, and how many times? And most hands went up, and I said, my case rests. This is education. You're implying that if the public is sufficiently well educated on the subject, it will be prepared on a voluntary basis to make the changes without any mandatory requirement to do so. I could go on with these, but time's running on, and there's quite a lot of other matters to refer to. One of these is to refer to the failure of negotiations in the last 20 years or so, for instance, in Copenhagen, Cancun, Warsaw. And the explanation for the failure is that each country's representatives there believe in these assumptions that I've just referred to. Moreover, their brief was, we can be sure, to act on behalf of their nation's interests, not global interests, let alone those of future generations whose interests are almost exclusively excluded from the process. I mean, do we not have a responsibility to make decisions which reflect that? And that again is illustrated by the term, which many of you have heard, peak oil, meaning that we're very close to a situation where of the world's reserves of oil, about half have already been used up. And if you ask the decision makers, what are you worried about? They will say, well, don't you know the world's running out of oil? And I say, who's running out of oil? And they say, well, we're all running out of oil. And I say, does this we include future generations' claims on these finite resources? And there's an embarrassed studying of shoes at that point, because, of course, that hasn't even been considered. What sort of morality does one find in this sort of approach where one can disregard the claims of one's children, grandchildren, and generations beyond, as if they've got no claim because, in effect, we got there first and we'll go on using them and hope that we can make a transition to green futures which don't pose the problems that we are now tackling. Quite extraordinary. And all this leads to the prospects for future generations, which I want to dwell on briefly, but because of time, but very important indeed. We can be sure that the legacy that we're leaving to the generations succeeding us will include, and just listen to this, regions of the world becoming uninhabitable at an accelerating rate. We can already observe it, for instance, in parts of Africa, but all over the world there is evidence of this fact. We can be sure that there'll be extensive water and food shortages owing to sharply declining crop yields and crop failure in many countries. We can be sure that there will be a catastrophic loss of life as a consequence of what I've just said, and likely wars of survival, because that's the source of the evolutionary process. Where things get hard, you fight for your own, you don't fight in the global interest. There'll be widespread decrease of species diversity and genetic variability. Little of the planet's key mineral will be left for those succeeding us. There's the horrific risk of nuclear war owing to weapons applicable technology proliferation. There will be the imposition on thousands of future generations, if they exist, the absolute requirement to guard against radioactive waste stemming from our reliance on and spreading reliance on nuclear power leaking from its repositories. There will be considerable financial debt. We've only got to see what our government is running up, owing to our recent failure to live within our means. And finally, and this is particularly sad, we have all lived lives in which we could somehow look to a future which was going to improve. Even during wartime, we knew that it was a matter of time before the war comes to an end. for future generations, for the next generations, that will no longer hold true. Because they will be living in a world in which news of our failure to meet the climate change challenge will get progressively, inescapably grimmer. They will be reading on a far more frequent basis, or reading in the papers or on television or from whatever source, ever grimmer stories about calamities that are occurring in the world. And what we will do, rely on our instincts to look after ourselves. A few days ago, I went to a conference where Lord Krebs, who's the chairman of a subcommittee of the Climate Change Committee, and he was talking on the issue of adaptation to climate change. And what was his focus? On the UK's adaptation and showing how that could be achieved. I raised the question with him, which I think embarrassed him strongly. I said, how dare we talk about how we can survive the damage caused by climate change when we are the responsible for it? Surely you can't sort of say, well, we can find ways and means and we can afford to take such measures as to adapt to it, you know, with sea level rises or increased temperatures or whatever. What about the third world, who are already suffering far more than we are? And yet we're in effect saying, yes, but you know, we've got to look after our own before we have to worry about third world. And of course his response was to say, you mustn't assume that the UK government isn't making a contribution in terms of overseas aid so that third world countries can indeed adapt as well. Well, it's complete nonsense. I mean, it's just sort of words, because the scale of imposition of change in order to limit the damage of climate change is far, far greater in countries like Bangladesh than it is in this country. So what is to be done? Because it would appear that as a species we're unable to face up to the absolute need for such changes in behaviour as are seen to be unacceptable and undesirable. It seems, in my view, to be a situation where of a sort of collective amnesia, people not wanting to know, and it is so deeply rooted now that there are very serious grounds for despair. So what do? Well, we recognise, of course, that climate change is a global problem requiring a global solution. And the one which I'm wholly convinced is the only way out of our predicament, and even then, it's less than perfect owing to our dilatoriness. I mean, should let you know that I've been making giving very similar talks on this subject and writing books on this same subject for the last 25 years. The failure of my ability to communicate the gravity of the situation, no doubt. But the only way that we can take is the Global Commons Institute's framework proposal called Contraction and Convergence, which I hope many of you are familiar, and those who aren't, I strongly recommend that you look at the website of the Global Commons Institute and see the remarkable work that Aubrey Mayer, M-E-Y-E-R, has done since he founded and since that time directed the Global Commons Institute in its work. Contraction and convergence is an ingenious means that is speedily gaining support around the world. It's based on the UN Climate Treaty's principle of precaution and equity, by which the future allocation of a carbon allowance or ration becomes equal globally by an agreed year, with aggregate global emissions reduced year on year to the relatively safe level of concentration. Its adoption is inevitable, or we are doomed. Overall, contraction and convergence has unique characteristics, first and foremost amongst which are that governments are assured of success in delivering the internationally agreed degree of reduction in gases, because that's how it will be set to ensure that that limit is not exceeded. This is in marked contrast to the current ridiculous strategy for the next significant climate change meeting next year in Paris, based on, believe it or not, each country being able to choose what target on reduction it is prepared to bring to the table. I mean, one can't think of a more inadequate call on world governments than say, what are you prepared to do? Because obviously self-interest, that's what governments are there to look after its own public, not after the global interest, let alone the interests of future generations. I do strongly urge you to look at the GCI website, and especially to come to terms with the latest work that Dr Mayer has done with the development of the carbon budget accounting tool. Its modelling capacity enables the user to see the consequences in terms of temperature rise, sea level rise, ocean acidification, and regional, country, and equal per capita carbon emissions in relation to any future date, global carbon budget, and so on. It indicates in a remarkably straightforward way the extent to which current policies on climate change fail, such as those of the UK with its target of the 80% reduction by 2050, let alone those of the Obama administration with its target of a 17% reduction by 2020. Bear in mind that in this country, per capita emissions are of the order of about 10 to 12 tonnes per annum. In the States, it's over 20. So to talk about a 17% reduction on 20 tonnes is not. It doesn't give one much hope about the future, when it implies is that still 83% will go on being emitted by its large population. The implementation of contraction and convergence in the form of annual but tradable personal carbon allowances is its logical manifestation. I first spelled this out in 1990. Its adoption will act as a driver towards minimising the awesome impact of climate change far more effectively than by relying on the setting of targets and encouraging individuals to engage in green practices which are unlikely to be met owing to unforeseen political, economic and practical circumstances. It contrasts sharply with current policies by which, in general, the affluent world has been advantaged by its unfair share of fossil fuels. Instead, people who are not contributing to the degradation of the planet's climate system become recipients of a rising revenue from the sale of their unused carbon allowances to those disengaging from their energy profligate activities. So what will the world look like under such a system? Well, all sectors of the economy, as well as our personal lifestyles, will inevitably have to be transformed when we're living within a per capita ration, as we did with food during the last war. Bearing in mind the embedded energy in the existing infrastructure, the balance between demolition and refurbishment will be dramatically altered, and the impact of a low carbon approach to public policy objectives will have to be comprehensively measured in terms of energy conservation. Long-distance commuting, holidays, global business activity will rapidly become a thing of the past. This will need to be done to take account from an energy perspective, not only of all the stages of materials used in new developments, but also the transport and infrastructural implications for its users. No developments will be able to be sanctioned in isolation from the fundamental imperative of ensuring absolutely minimal use of fossil fuels. Its relevance to major conurbations is even greater than to other human settlements. So, in conclusion, what I want to say is that we're now well beyond the stage of denial of the threat of climate change and its importance. The prospects are grim indeed if little more than lip service continues to be paid to massively curbing our fossil fuel-based activities. It seems to me incomprehensible that we can continue to believe that the democratic process is sacrosanct. And here I'm raising a critical issue in view of the fact that we need to bear. So heading over the top there, to thine own self be true. If we really take that to heart, then we've got to understand that the democratic process requires that the majority view must prevail. The majority of the public, certainly in the affluent part of the world, is not prepared to make the massive reductions that are necessary. Do we subscribe to the democratic approach to decision-making, or, in this instance, as I would argue, it has got to be set aside? Whether the world public like it or not, those changes have got to be made. This is the dilemma that we've been brought to by virtue of the inability of successive generations of decision makers have put us in this dilemma simply because they see that it is more likely that they will be elected if they don't spell out the gravity of the situation. We are all complicit in our failure to press for international agreement to effect the massive but essential changes in the behaviour of the world's population. If, as seems highly likely, that agreement is not forthcoming, we will assuredly hand over a dying planet to the generations succeeding us. Thank you.
Thank you, Marv. That was a great introduction. I agree with nearly all of it, but I have to take issue with you on a couple of points, namely your view of democracy. You actually believe that the West has a real democracy. No, it's not. It's a plutocracy. It's an oligarchy. The views of the working classes and the intelligentsia are more moral, more ethical than the people really at the top. There's just a handful of plutocrats who control government policy because they've bought out the politicians by, both in the US and here, by huge donations to their parties. And also the mass media, especially people like the BBC, have a very biased approach in favour of this governmental approach. And I also have to take issue with some things. You didn't say this, but the Green movement has also put out some bad ideas like biofuels. And I attended a small demonstration on Wednesday night, which went quite well, against the massive proposal to use 16 million tonnes of, up to 60 million tonnes of wood burning in power stations. And I have to point out that this just puts carbon dioxide straight into the air. It's worse than burning an equivalent amount of coal. And it will take a century for that ever to get back, whereas if you left the trees standing, they would continue to absorb carbon dioxide. Also, another rotten thing the Green movement has done is to kill off tidal power, kill off the several powers. So a lot of the people who should be in the dock are in fact come from the environmental movement. Thank you.
I'll surprise you by saying I agree with almost all that you have said, but refer this audience to your opening remark that you agree largely with what I've said. As far as democracy is concerned, you're quite right, but when I refer to democracy, I mean, of course, not in its true sense, but in terms of the democratic process, which is the one used around the world, which has the failings that you cite. Likewise, I agree with you on the other points, like on biofuels. Nevertheless, you're right, you said I didn't make a reference to it, but you're absolutely right on that as well. So you're almost totally on board. Yes.
Rupert Reed, just to respond to the second couple of points there, you say the Green movement's been responsible for biofuels. I think that's a complete falsehood. So, for example, I was one of the founders of an organisation called Large Scale Biofuel Concern about 12 years ago, and the Green Party, from an early stage, spoke out against the biofuels bubble. Biofuels was about businesses. businesses who greenwashed themselves, and the authentic green movement got, at a very early stage, opposed the rush to biofuels. In terms of the seven, it's very complicated. I can just speak for the Green Party. The Green Party policy is to have tidal power in the seven, just not via a complete barrage, which would have very serious, it's not the only way of doing it. So you can potentially have a tidal reef or tidal lagoons.
Can I just add a rider to that, which relates to an early remark I made, and it is again extraordinary oversight on the part of nearly all of us, which is the way in which governments treat public demand. They treat it as, to a degree, sacrosanct. You know, if public wants something, it is the responsibility of government to cater for it. But public demand is made on, and I think I made it in my opening remarks, but it's worth repeating. Public demand stems from decisions made by individuals without any, or very little indeed, regard to the wider social, economic, and particularly the environmental consequences. And yet that is, in effect, the brief that government takes. People want to fly all over the world, so we've got to provide more airports. At the heart of the matter is the fact that this sacrosanct element of public demand needs to be seriously challenged, as if, as I said, governments have a responsibility to do as much as possible to meet that public demand. The demand must be met within the planet's ability not to be damaged by any process. That's the overriding consideration.
Yeah, thank you. We live in a planet with finite resources, and society, as we've made clear, is not prepared to change. The politicians can't change it because they're short-termist by nature. Their period in office is short-term. The business people don't want to change it. They have vested interests and so on and so on. People aren't going to change. So you've been saying that people will not, the governments will not sign up to what they need to sign up to. They won't do what they need to do. So the solution seems to me to be in alternative forms of energy. And you said earlier that nuclear power and weapons proliferation were linked. Now, okay, there is always a dirty bomb possibility, but things like thorium reactors don't make fissile material. And the reason why we don't use them is because all the money that went into the investment in nuclear power would only be invested when there was fissile material produced by the power station to provide the material for the Cold War to build your weapons. They wouldn't investigate the other nuclear options because they didn't give them any military clout. There are other options that are a lot safer. Instead of trying to bottle it in, you've got to kind of tickle a thorium reactor to keep it going, if that makes sense. And they are small and compact. We already have nuclear reactors in many hospitals, providing material with short half-lives of 12, 24 hours. They have to be made on site. So these things are possible. You seem to not like the idea of trains, but if we want to try and keep a society going, similar standards to what we have, and let other people develop, other societies develop to a good standard. You know, that someone who exists now in Namibia is as valid as your or my great-great-great-grandchild. So if we want them to be able to live decently, we need more energy. It's an energy problem.
Any suggestion like that, on the development of nuclear power, implies that we have got the time to develop a program which applies across the world. Because if we're saying that we can, let's say in the UK, by developing nuclear power, a program of installations for the generation of electricity, we are, as I said before, implying that all countries should be able to do so. But I ask the question, by what year do you believe that it is possible? Because that's essential, that the whole world is running on this. It's no good just some countries doing it. If other countries are unable or prevented from doing so, I don't see the United Nations being happy about every country in the world for instance, it's not happy for that development in some countries already. By what year and is there the money available? And against the background of the fact that greenhouse gas emissions are accumulating at an alarming rate, making it even more difficult, I come back to the point is that the origin of your remarks, I think, is, again, how do we meet public demand for sources of energy?
One of the big worries with climate change is instability, social instability,
yes,
riots, wars. There's already fighting in Ethiopia and Tanzania over water at Benue River.
People living in Bangladesh want to remain in the delta regions in which they're living now. Because people want something, it doesn't mean to say that can be delivered. People want to go on treating the world as their oyster for tourist purposes, for business purposes and so on. They cannot have that.
If saying no, in the end, it's going to cause social instability.
I'd like to just develop a little bit more what the previous... I actually started as a techno-optimist in contrast to the speaker, and I think this actually can be dealt with. It can't be dealt with without some problems, but the actual thing about energy, it is quite clear, I think, that when you look at the connection between individual energy consumption, wealth and family size, you see that if people are wealthy, they don't have big families, the population can be addressed in that way, and they can only be wealthy. A necessary condition of being wealthy is adequate amounts of energy. And so there is a connection there. And so coming back to the adequate amounts of energy, I think I have to take you back just for a moment to what happened. The nuclear era started with a very big bang, or two very big bangs actually, but even before those bangs, a few months before those bangs, the people in the Chicago laboratory who'd actually made the bomb possible were talking about what do we do with this nuclear energy now we know we can do it. And the Nobel Prize winners and things who joined in this debate, Wigner, Urey, people like that, they said, we have to think, how do you do nuclear power? And they said, we think that a nuclear power creator, the word reactor wasn't used, and it was called an atomic pile, that they think that the useful atomic pile will be a chemical device, not a mechanical device. And if it's a chemical device, you use liquids, not solids, as the fuel. And so the idea of a liquid-fueled fission device was even before the bomb went off. And they went even one step further, amazingly, when you look back and think, and they said, actually, if you think what liquid would be the one to use, they said it'll probably be a molten salt, that's an ionic liquid, and it will probably be a fluoride salt. I mean, they came to that conclusion before the bombs even went off. And a very perverse situation then arose because the military wanted nuclear devices for propelling ships, so that submarines in particular, they wanted nuclear-powered submarines so it could stay there for a long time. They wanted a nuclear-powered aircraft, and they weren't particularly interested in energy, because if you look back to that time, we're talking about 1945, 50, the world population was probably about 3 billion, and no one talked about climate change and the limitations on renewable, resources, natural resources. It wasn't a topic of conversation. And so in that perverse climate, they went for the easiest way of doing a nuclear submarine, which happened to be, they happened to have ready a solid-fueled, liquid, water-cooled reactor. And that became the industry standard. And we've now got about nearly 500 of them worldwide. Sorry?
Is there a question? Can you wrap it up? It's very interesting, I must say.
Okay. Well, the point I'm trying to make is that we know how to do it. There is a big problem in doing it, in that industry doesn't want to do it because they've all, as previous contributors said, they put all their money into doing it the wrong way. But we're at the end of that era. It's lasted far too long, the first nuclear. The second one has to start as soon as possible. And if it started immediately, we'll be able to get rid of all fossil fuel burning by 2050, not by outlawing it, but simply the market forces will remove it because it will be cheaper to supply the energy properly with nuclear power. It's not done properly now.
Yeah. Did you want to comment?
Well, just briefly, as I gave an answer to an earlier question, it is in every instance where one's citing some alternative course of action, one has got to be satisfied, number one, that there is time for it to be applied globally, that it can be afforded by all the countries involved, and that the public support it, certainly the majority of the public support it, and even then that there's a programme whereby we can be assured of it. And then finally, the point I make over and over again is, by that date, what will be the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and will it not almost certainly be beyond the reversible level, because we're already close to that. And that's why I am have such a grim outlook. I just make the last point, if I may, because I think it is so important that we have evolved as a species by virtue of putting ourselves at the centre of the universe. Each individual born starts off by looking after his or her own interests. There is some modicum of altruism in our behaviour, but basically, when the chips are down, you fight for your own survival. In this instance, we've reached a stage in the evolutionary process where that can no longer be accepted, because what we've got to do is to reverse the process of thinking we are at the centre, the next is our country, the next is our continent, the next is our world, and the last thing we need worry about is the future generation. We've got to turn that on its head and have right at the heart of the matter, our responsibility for future generations, then our responsibility at the global level, particularly for third world countries, then for countries with ourselves as individuals and our families at the bottom of the list rather than at the top. Unless we can be persuaded that that is possible to achieve, in other words, running totally counter to the whole evolutionary process, we are doomed. I mean, there's no escape from it. We can't just hope that technology is going to ride to the rescue. The question is, do we see that we have this responsibility or not? And if I can just put a question just for my own interest, would you be kind enough to put up your hands, those of you who are on a voluntary basis prepared to stop flying, just as an illustration? That's about a third, and of course this is an audience which is already, you wouldn't have come along unless you were concerned on the subject, but nevertheless it does illustrate the degree of tractability we have about where we go. You know, in other words, the majority of you are not prepared on a voluntary basis. If it's not on a voluntary basis, then it has got to be on a mandatory basis, or not at all. And to be on a mandatory basis, it is anti-democratic. You're obliging people to do things that they aren't prepared to tolerate on their own. And that is a very intriguing, but the subject for a longer discussion.
If for no other reason that some of us will need to go to the Louvre, quite desperately. So we'll restart in about 3 minutes. So Lou's just up the corridor, easy to find. Thank you so much, Mayor. Please, thank you. Thanks, Mayor.